The Untold Files.
July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant. The lunch crowd filled the narrow dining room with the smell of fried chicken, collard greens, and cornbread. At a corner table near the back, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known to every soul in Harlem as Bumpy, sat with three old friends, laughing over stories from the old days. He was 62 years old. His health had been failing for months. The doctors at Harlem Hospital had warned him: heart disease, high blood pressure, too many years of stress and violence. But Bumpy Johnson didn't talk about dying. He talked about living. He ordered his usual fried fish, rice, and collard greens. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. His friends noticed he looked tired. The lines in his face had deepened. His hands, once quick and deadly, trembled slightly when he lifted his fork. But his eyes were still sharp, still watching, still calculating. At approximately 2:15 p.m., Bumpy Johnson stood up from the table. He said he needed some air. He took 2 steps toward the door, clutched his chest, and collapsed. His friends rushed to him. Someone called an ambulance. Within minutes, Harlem Hospital received the emergency call. Bumpy Johnson was down. By the time the ambulance arrived, Bumpy was unconscious. The paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to Harlem Hospital, just blocks away. At 2:47 p.m., doctors pronounced Ellsworth Raymond Johnson dead on arrival. Cause of death: massive heart attack. He had been under federal indictment for narcotics conspiracy. He was free on $50,000 bail. He would never stand trial. The news spread through Harlem like wildfire. Within an hour, crowds began gathering outside Harlem Hospital. Bumpy Johnson is dead. The Godfather of Harlem is dead. Some people wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence. Bumpy had been a fixture in Harlem for more than 40 years. He had fought wars against the Italian mob. He had survived assassination attempts, ambushes, and betrayals. He had served time in some of the most brutal prisons in America, including Alcatraz, and now, at age 62, his heart had simply given out. At his apartment at 470 Lenox Avenue, his wife, Mamie Johnson, received the phone call. She collapsed when she heard the words, "Bumpy is gone." The man who had survived bullets and bombs, who had faced down the mafia and the Klan, had been killed by his own heart. By nightfall, the entire city knew. Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's most powerful crime boss, the last of the old-school gangsters, the man who linked the black underworld to the Italian mafia, was dead. And Harlem would never be the same. The New York Times would later report, his death marked the end of an era. Lieutenant Calvin Boxley of the NYPD 6th Division told reporters he was the last of the Dutch Schultz-Oni Matten crowd. His death marked the end of an era. Bumpy was the link between Harlem, the West Side, and the East Side, the mafia. But he had no mob. He didn't have any criminal empire to leave to anyone. The lieutenant added, "Don't make him an idol. He was a hoodlum, a stone hoodlum." But to the people of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was something more. He was a protector, a benefactor, a symbol of black power and black pride in an era when both were dangerous to claim. He had donated money to civil rights organizations. He had kept white mobsters from exploiting Harlem's residents. He had enforced his own code of honor in a world without rules. And now he was gone. The question on everyone's mind was simple. What happens next? Who takes over? Will there be a war for control of Harlem? Will the Italians move in? Will rival gangs fight for Bumpy's territory? The city held its breath, and the police prepared for the worst. On Monday morning, July 8, 1968, Mamie Johnson and her family met with Wallace Dade, the owner of the Rodney Dade Funeral Home at 2332 7th Avenue, near 137th Street. Dad had been a friend of Bumpy's for decades. He told Mamie, had he been well directed, in the sense that he had an opportunity to put to good use the talents he had, he would have succeeded in many fields. He was a man that, strangely, I respected. He would never allow the Caucasian majority to run roughshod over him or the community he lived in. The funeral home became the center of Harlem's mourning. Within hours, floral arrangements began arriving. Wreaths, pillows, crosses, massive displays from nightclub owners, numbers runners, street crews, and legitimate businessmen who had known Bumpy for decades. By Tuesday, more than 70 floral arrangements lined the walls of the funeral chapel. The casket was African plank mahogany, full length with brass handles. Bumpy Johnson was dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, and tie. On his hands were a rosary and a St. Christopher's medal. His face, in death, looked peaceful. The lines of pain and stress had smoothed away. He looked younger, almost serene. Mamie Johnson requested that the casket remain open for public viewing. She wanted the people of Harlem to see Bumpy one last time, to say goodbye, to pay their respects. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday night, July 11th at St. True, Martin's Episcopal Church, Lenox Avenue and 122nd Street. Reverend John H. Johnson would officiate. Billy Daniels, the famous nightclub performer, would sing My Buddy. Reverend Richard J. Scannell of the College of Mount St. Vincent and Bishop Alvin A. Childs of Faith Temple would also participate. But planning the funeral was only half the challenge. The NYPD was bracing for potential violence. Captain James Hartley of the 28th Precinct convened an emergency meeting on Tuesday afternoon. Intelligence reports suggested that rival gangs were already positioning for control of Bumpy's former territory. Frank Lucas, Bumpy's former driver and protege, was reportedly gathering men. Italian mob families from downtown were watching closely. There were rumors of contract hits, revenge killings, and power grabs. Captain Hartley told his officers, "We expect thousands at this funeral, maybe 5,000, maybe more." Bumpy Johnson was loved by this community, but he also had enemies, lots of enemies. Some of them will be at that funeral. We need eyes everywhere. The NYPD mobilized more than 200 officers. Uniformed patrolmen would line the streets around St. Martin's Church. Plainclothes detectives would mingle with the crowds, watching for known criminals and potential troublemakers. And on the rooftops of buildings surrounding the church, police snipers would take up positions with rifles. Their orders were clear: watch for weapons, watch for movements, watch for anything that could turn this funeral into a bloodbath. Lieutenant Boxley briefed his men. Bumpy Johnson's death leaves a power vacuum in Harlem. When there's a vacuum, men fight to fill it. We've seen this before. Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese. When the old boss dies, the young wolves come out. Our job is to make sure this funeral stays peaceful. On Wednesday, July 10th, the New York Times published Bumpy Johnson's obituary under the headline, "Bumpy John, 62, Gambler is Dead." The article noted that Johnson was stricken while dining with friends Sunday at Wells Restaurant at 2T49 7th Avenue and was taken to Harlem Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. He was 62 years old and had lived at 470 Lenox Avenue. The funeral of Ellsworth R. Bumpy Johnson, a Harlem underworld figure, will be held tomorrow at St. Martin's Episcopal Church, 122 D Street and Lenox Avenue. He had been convicted of selling narcotics and had served sentences of 2 10s and a 5 in several federal and state prisons. In prison, he studied history, philosophy, and chess. He was reputed to be one of the best chess players in Harlem. He also wrote poetry. 3 of Bumpy's poems had been published in Freedomways, a quarterly review of the Black Freedom Movement. One poem, titled Democracy at Home, read, "Black babes are spat upon, their mothers raped while mobsters howl the police stood and gaped. Slies their homes are burned, their churches mood defiled, and their appeals are answered, wait a while." The obituary sparked debate across New York. Was Bumpy Johnson a criminal or a hero? A gangster or a civil rights advocate? A predator or a protector? The answer, as with most complex men, was all of the above. By Wednesday night, the viewing at Rodney Dade Funeral Home had drawn hundreds of visitors. People lined up outside the chapel waiting hours for a chance to see Bumpy one last time. Old men in fedoras, young men in leather jackets, women in Sunday dresses, children holding their mothers' hands. They filed past the open casket, whispering prayers, dropping flowers, touching the edge of the mahogany. Outside, NYPD patrol cars circled the block. Detectives took photographs of known criminals in the crowd. They made notes. They watched. They waited. Thursday, July 11th, 1968. By 5 p.m., the streets around St. Martin's Episcopal Church were packed. Lenox Avenue from a 120th Street to a 125th Street was a sea of humanity. Estimates would later put the crowd at over 5,000 people. Some came to mourn, some came to pay respects, some came out of curiosity, and some came because they knew history was being made. This was the end of an era. The casket had been transported from the funeral home to the church in a black hearse. Pallbearers carried it up the steps of St. Martin's and placed it at the altar. The church could hold about 1,200 people. Every pew was filled. Every aisle was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the back, craning their necks to see the casket. The scent of flowers was overwhelming. On the rooftops of the buildings surrounding St. Martin's Church, NYPD snipers took their positions. They carried Remington Model 700 bolt-action rifles with telescopic sights. They wore plainclothes to avoid alarming the crowd. Their job was simple: scan for threats, watch for weapons, prevent an assassination. One sniper, Officer Raymond Kowalski, later recalled, "We were told to expect the worst. Bumpy Johnson had a lot of enemies, mob bosses, rival gangs, cops, politicians. Anyone could have taken a shot that night. We were up there to make sure nobody did." From the rooftops, the snipers had a clear view of the church entrance, the street, and the crowd. They communicated via radio with plainclothes detectives on the ground. Inside the church, the funeral service began at 7 p.m. Reverend John H. Johnson stood at the pulpit. He looked out at the packed congregation and said, "We are here tonight to remember a man, a complex man, a man who decided he was not going to be anybody's clown, anyone's flunky. Above all, he despised phonies and hypocrites. In a world filled with social contamination and double talk, maybe there was no other way to be a man." The mourners nodded. Some wept, others sat in stony silence. Mame Johnson sat in the front pew, surrounded by family. She wore a black dress and a black veil. Her face was swollen from crying. Next to her sat Bumpy's daughters, Ruthie and Delisi, and several close friends. Billy Daniels, the legendary nightclub singer, stood and walked to the front of the church. The pianist began to play. Daniels sang "My Buddy," his voice rich and mournful. "Nights are long since you went away. I think about you all through the day. My buddy Slatchen, nobody quite so true." The crowd listened in silence. Many wept openly. Daniels's voice cracked with emotion. He had known Bumpy for over 20 years. They had shared meals, drinks, and secrets. And now his friend was gone. After the song, Bishop Alvin A. Childs of Faith Temple delivered a prayer. Reverend Richard J. Scannell of the College of Mount St. Vincent spoke about redemption and forgiveness. And then Reverend Johnson delivered the eulogy. He spoke of Bumpy's childhood in Charleston, South Carolina, his journey to Harlem in the 1920s, his rise through the criminal underworld, his wars with Dutch Schultz, his years in prison, his poetry, his donations to civil rights groups, his protection of the Harlem community. Reverend Johnson said Bumpy Johnson was not a saint. He was a sinner like all of us. But he was also a man who stood up, who fought back, who refused to bow down to anyone. He lived on his own terms, and he died the same way. Outside, the crowd of over 5,000 people spilled into the streets. At least 200 stood directly outside the church, unable to get in. They listened to the service through open windows. They sang along with the hymns. They prayed. Police officers stood guard at every corner. They scanned the crowd for weapons. They watched for sudden movements. They kept their hands near their service revolvers. On the rooftops, the snipers never took their eyes off the street. One officer radioed down to the ground units. We've got eyes on 3 known associates of the Genovese family, southeast corner near the bodega. They're just watching. No weapons visible. Another sniper reported. Frank Lucas just arrived. He's got 6 men with him. They're standing near the church entrance. No hostile movements. Inside, the service concluded at 8:45 p.m. The pallbearers lifted the casket and carried it out of the church. The crowd outside parted to let them through. The casket was loaded into the hearse. Mame Johnson and the family followed. The hearse drove slowly down Lenox Avenue, headed for Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where Bumpy would be buried. The crowd followed on foot for several blocks, then gradually dispersed. By 10 p.m., Lenox Avenue was quiet again. The funeral was over. The NYPD snipers climbed down from the rooftops. The patrol cars left. The detectives packed up their cameras and notebooks, and Harlem exhaled. There had been no violence, no gunfire, no assassinations, no war. Just 5,000 people saying goodbye to the man who had ruled their streets for 4 decades. On Friday, July 12, 1968, the New York Times published a front-page article titled "Harlem Marks Death of Bumpy and an Era in the Underworld." The article noted that hundreds of people walked through a flower-decked funeral chapel in Harlem yesterday to view the body, and that more than 1,200 mourners attended the funeral service at St. Martin's Church. The Times also reported that at least 200 stood in the street under the eye of policemen on roofs across the street. The article quoted Lieutenant Boxley. Bumpy was the link between Harlem, the West Side, and the East Side, the Mafia. But he had no mob. He didn't have any criminal empire to leave to anyone. But that wasn't entirely true. Bumpy Johnson did leave an empire. It just wasn't formally organized. He controlled Harlem's numbers racket, which generated millions of dollars annually. He had political connections, police contacts, and alliances with Italian mob families. He had street crews, enforcers, and loyal lieutenants. The question was, who would inherit it? In the days after the funeral, several men made their moves. Frank Lucas, who had been Bumpy's driver and protege, began consolidating power. He met with former Bumpy associates and made it clear the organization would continue under his leadership. He had connections in Southeast Asia for heroin importation. He had the infrastructure. He had the muscle. Within weeks, Lucas would launch his Blue Magic heroin brand, which would make him one of the richest criminals in America. Meanwhile, the Italian mob families downtown watched closely. The Genovese family, led by Thomas Everly, considered moving into Harlem. The Lucchese family discussed expanding their operations north. The Colombo family sent emissaries to meet with former Bumpy associates. Everyone wanted a piece of Harlem. The NYPD continued surveillance. Detectives from the Narcotics Division began building cases against Lucas and other emerging figures. They knew the power vacuum would lead to violence. They knew the streets would run red before a new order was established. But they also knew they couldn't prevent it. All they could do was watch, wait, and arrest the survivors. By the end of July, Harlem had changed. The old rules were gone. Bumpy's code of honor, his protection of the community, his resistance to hard drugs, all of it evaporated. Frank Lucas flooded Harlem with heroin. Overdose deaths spiked, crime rates soared. The streets that Bumpy had kept relatively stable descended into chaos. Community leaders begged for intervention. Reverend Johnson, who had eulogized Bumpy, said, "We have lost our protector." Bumpy was a criminal, yes, but he kept order. He kept the worst predators out. Now we have wolves feeding on our children. Mame Johnson retreated from public life. She lived quietly at the Lenox Avenue apartment, surrounded by memories. She would later write a memoir, Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, published in 2008, 40 years after his death. In it, she would describe Bumpy as a loving husband, a generous man, and a fierce protector of his community. She would defend his legacy against those who called him a criminal, and nothing more. And she would mourn him until her own death in 2009, at the age of 94. Bumpy Johnson was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, Section 208, Lot 302. His grave is marked by a simple headstone, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, 1905 to 1968. To this day, visitors leave flowers, coins, and handwritten notes. Some thank him for protecting Harlem, others ask for blessings, and some simply write, "Rest in power, Bumpy." In the decades since Bumpy Johnson's death, his legend has only grown. He has been portrayed in films like The Cotton Club, Hoodlum, and American Gangster. He has been the subject of documentaries, biographies, and academic studies. In 2019, Forrest Whitaker portrayed him in the television series Godfather of Harlem, which dramatized his life and struggles. Historians debate his legacy. Was he a criminal who exploited his community, or a protector who stood up to white supremacy and mafia domination? The truth, as always, is more complex. Bumpy Johnson was born on October 31, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina. He moved to Harlem in the 1920s during the height of the Harlem Renaissance. He worked for Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers, and helped her fight off Dutch Schultz's attempt to take over Harlem's gambling rackets in the 1930s. After St. Clair's retirement, Bumpy became the dominant figure in Harlem. He brokered deals with Italian mob families, paying them a percentage of his profits in exchange for protection and cooperation. He enforced discipline within the black underworld. He protected community institutions like churches, schools, and small businesses. He donated to civil rights organizations, and he maintained a code of honor that forbade violence against women, children, and civilians. But he was also a criminal. He ran illegal gambling operations. He dealt in narcotics, though he tried to keep hard drugs out of Harlem. He ordered murders. He bribed police and politicians. He lived by violence and died knowing he had blood on his hands. In prison, he studied philosophy, history, and chess. He wrote poetry that critiqued racism and inequality. He maintained friendships with intellectuals, artists, and activists. He was, in short, a contradiction. A gangster with a conscience. A criminal with a code. A man shaped by a world that offered him few legitimate paths to power. The funeral in 1968 was a testament to his impact. 5,000 mourners, police snipers on rooftops, a community holding its breath, waiting to see if the end of Bumpy Johnson would mean the end of peace in Harlem. It did. Within months, Harlem was flooded with heroin. Frank Lucas, the man who had walked into Bumpy's funeral and declared himself the heir, would build a drug empire that destroyed thousands of lives. He would be arrested in 1975 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He would cooperate with authorities, betraying dozens of associates, and he would be remembered not as Bumpy's successor, but as his betrayer. Bumpy Johnson's death marked the end of the old Harlem, the Harlem of jazz clubs and numbers runners, the Harlem of community protection and criminal honor, the Harlem where gangsters lived by codes and neighborhoods had kings. After Bumpy, Harlem became just another drug market, just another war zone, just another statistic in America's failed war on drugs. That is why, nearly 60 years later, people still visit his grave, still tell his stories, still debate his legacy, because in a world that offered black men few avenues to power, Bumpy Johnson took power. He held it, he wielded it, and he refused to bow down. His funeral, with its 5,000 mourners and police snipers on rooftops, was not just the burial of a man. It was the burial of an era when Harlem had its own kings, when the streets had their own rules, when power, however illegal, was in the hands of the community. The NYPD expected a war that night. They expected gunfire, assassinations, and chaos. What they got was 5,000 people, black and white, rich and poor, criminal and civilian, standing together to say goodbye to a man who had defined their world for 4 decades. That is the power of Bumpy Johnson's legacy. Not the violence, not the crime, not the murders, but the fact that when he died, an entire community stopped. 5,000 people came to say goodbye. Police snipers watched from rooftops expecting blood, but there was none. Just respect, just mourning, just the end of an era. And Harlem has never been the same.